All right. Well, thank you, Eric. That was really nice of you to say all that, and saves me from having to repeat it myself. So everybody's an expert on me now, so we can just get right into it. But seriously, I want to thank the Golden Gate Bird Alliance for partnering with Wild Latitudes for all these years. Basically, actually, and Eric, it was actually about, believe it or not, 7 or 8 years ago now. And my very first tour with the Wild Latitudes was a tour with Golden Gate. We went to Alaska, and you really helped us, when our business was new. It was a great partnership, and it continues to be. And you've sent us all these great folks who've, gone on our tours, and, we've always had a good time. So it's just always a pleasure to talk to you guys down there in California. I'm up here in Portland, Oregon, and life is good. So hopefully everybody can see me okay, and I will go ahead and get on with the show. So, as Eric said, I know we talked about birds of the Oregon coast, and we will be talking about birds of the Oregon coast, but we'll talk about birds elsewhere because I didn't read the memo and I thought we were talking about everything in Oregon. So I hope you all have about 6 hours because it's going to be a long, no, we're not going to be here that long. It'll be fun. Okay, so birds of Oregon. I actually grew up in California, Californian, until about 28 or 9. I came up to Oregon to go to grad school and never left. I grew up in Southern California, so I'm familiar with a lot of your birds that you have down there, and I've really enjoyed getting to know the birds up here. So let's see here. Interestingly, though, because California and Oregon are on the West Coast and they're right next to each other, they share a lot of similar habitats, at least Northern California and Oregon. There's a big question of what is the difference in terms of birds, right? And I think that's kind of interesting. So what I figured I would do, just be the easiest thing, because I didn't really have time to prepare for this talk, was I'm just going to read word for word the Wikipedia entry, and I'll just read off the list of 500 plus birds in Oregon, and we'll call it a night. Another joke, just kidding. Not going to do that, would never do that to you. We're going to actually talk about real cool things. So I was wondering, as I was putting this talk together, how many bird species are shared between California and Oregon. You may have some sense of that from your experience as birders, traveling between the two places perhaps. But off the bat, I didn't know. And as a scientist, I wanted to know. So I then was thinking, how many bird species are only in California, but not in Oregon, and vice versa? How many in Oregon, not in California, and so on. So naturally, because the eclipse is coming up, I did a total left turn, and now we're going to go and talk about astronomy, about how eclipses work. I'm sorry, I'm just doing a bunch of stupid jokes here in the beginning. Just this is my personality if you don't know me already. So we're not going to talk about eclipses, but I am going to show you a Venn diagram. So we've got two circles. We've got an orange one and a green one, and they represent California and Oregon. But what is actually going on here, we're talking about bird species. So California 606, Oregon 457. Now what's going on there? What I did was I took data from eBird for the two states from the last 40 years, not from all time, just the last 40 years. And I filtered out the very rare birds, the ones that maybe somebody saw like once, So this is not a super scientific way of doing things. It's just for us to get a sense of the shared avifauna between the two states. So California, not surprisingly, has more than Oregon, but there's some overlap. So that's the question, right? How much overlap is there? Is it like this diagram here where there's that kind of little slice in the middle of that magenta color showing the overlap? Or is it something different? And it does turn out that it is something different. There's a massive overlap in the bird species between the two states. California has 171 species that are only in California but not in Oregon. And Oregon has just 22 that are not in California. And, it's not that they could never be in the other state, and maybe once somebody saw one or something, but, just the way I pulled the data from eBird, this is kind of what I came up with. So it just gives you a sense of, if you're going to come birding in Oregon, you're not necessarily going to see a bunch of new stuff, right? It's not a destination for a Californian to go, hey, let me go, add a whole bunch of birds to my life list, unless you just haven't really been around California all that much. And the actual overlap, I should say, is 435 species there, but by my rough calculations. And Oregon has roughly 300 or so breeding bird species, so if you're just wondering about that. Now, I took it a step further, couldn't help myself, and I made this chart. And what this shows, and don't get nervous, what this shows is each dot represents a species, and what you're seeing is anything above the line here that's green, those are bird species that are more common in Oregon than they are in California. And the orange ones or yellow ones there are birds that are more common in California. The further away a bird species is from that center line, the more unique it is, if you will, to that state. So we can look at some examples. I should point out, though, here on the x-axis, you'll see a bunch of bird species names. I don't expect you to read that, so if you can't, don't worry. But it is arranged taxonomically. That's how the data comes out of eBird, from the most sort of ancient or primitive lineages like your pheasants and your ducks and geese and all that kind of stuff, going to the right where you have the more recently evolved species like songbirds. And so there's just some interesting patterns there taxonomically, where you see there's more spread in the songbirds for some reason, that there's more differences there. So I don't know what's going on, but it's interesting. So let's look at an outlier. We've got this little guy way up here. This is a bird species that is much more common in Oregon than it is in California. And so we wonder what that could be. Is it some weird, exotic, crazy thing? Maybe, but the answer is no. It is a black-capped chickadee. So in Oregon, we just have a lot more black-capped chickadees than you guys do. And that makes sense when you start to look at the species distribution. This is data also from eBird. We zoom in, we see that you get these black-capped chickadees a little bit in Northern California, but not too many elsewhere. I'm sure you get vagrants and things, but it's more of an Oregon thing. So if you want to see black-capped chickadees, come with me and I'll show you a whole bunch. They're right outside my house here. Okay, so another outlier. Now we're looking at an outlier in California, right? This is a species that's much more common in California than it is in Oregon. And that is a black phoebe. So probably one that you guys are very, very familiar with. We do have them here. And in fact, the black phoebe has been expanding its range in recent decades. So when I first moved here a couple decades ago, a black phoebe was a pretty special, unusual thing. And now we see them pretty regularly. And so again, we can look at the range map and see that. You guys just have this solid blob of purple where it's just nothing but black phoebes as far as your eye can see. And then zooming in here, you do see we have some in Oregon and they're expanding into my area here. And then one more outlier here in Oregon, a species we have more of than you guys do, and that is the American robin, another generally common bird, but apparently we have more of them than you do. So this is what data can tell us, folks. So if you're ever bored and you want to learn new things, just dig into the eBird. It's free data. It's pretty interesting. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch over to a different view here. So just one moment. Just setting things up for you. All right, there we go. That looks pretty good. So now we have a bigger view hopefully for everybody. So we're talking about birds of Oregon. So just want to do a kind of overview of the different ecoregions that we have here in Oregon. And these are the major ecoregions. There are, of course, many different subsets within these, and then there's habitats within those and microhabitats and so on. We're just doing broad strokes here, very broad strokes, but you see that there on the left we have the Coast Range, a north-south oriented mountain range, much like you guys have down there on the coast. The Willamette Valley, where I am, Portland is just right at the top here. So this kind of V-shaped valley, which is sandwiched between two mountain ranges, the Coast Range on the west and the Cascades on the east. And the west slopes of the Cascades are the really wet and green ones, whereas as you go east, things dry out. It's the rain shadow, right? You guys know all about that because you have Death Valley just on the east side of Mount Whitney, right? So, and then the Klamath Mountains we share with California down here in southwestern Oregon. And we also have the Columbia Plateau, the Blue Mountains, and the Northern Basin and Range, which also, again, we share with Nevada and Northern California. So if you're, when I go to a new place, a new destination, this is one of the things I do is I try to figure out the ecoregions and try to get my head around what are the major plants that are there, what are the major birds I would expect, wildlife, so on and so forth. So we have, very famously, we have lots of temperate rainforest here in the Pacific Northwest in Oregon. Of course, you guys have this as well. It gets sort of wetter as you go north in many places. And so this is one of the habitats that many folks like to enjoy when they come to Oregon. This is particularly along the coast, along the west side of our Coast Range Mountains, but also on the west side of the Cascades. And then we have our high mountains. So these are the Cascades Mountains themselves. These are the Three Sisters Peaks here. So lots of lakes and high peaks, alpine meadows, subalpine meadows, things like that. So a totally different habitat there. And then we have kind of in the central northern part of Oregon, we have the John Day River area or the Blue Mountains, these kind of really ancient, not super high elevation mountains that have really interesting geology, lots of awesome fossils, kind of a ponderosa pine and juniper grassland, sagebrush steppe, that sort of thing. Really beautiful country. And then down in much of the east and the eastern southern part of Oregon, we have lots of sagebrush steppe and, of course, man-modified landscapes like ranch land and things. Very open, very empty country, very quiet, very beautiful. And, of course, we have the Oregon coast, which is a stone's throw from me here in Portland and is very scenic, very pretty in many places. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Okay. So what we're looking at here is the outline of Oregon, and we're looking at, again, data from eBird. And we're looking at sort of a heat map of species diversity. So the warmer the color is, the darker it is, the more species there are. So you see we have some kind of hot spots running along the Willamette Valley here. And so I'm gonna highlight each of these areas as we go along here today. And these kind of five major areas, including the coast. So we'll kind of take a look at each of them. And this is what, if I were coming to Oregon and I was going to do a solo birding trip and I was going to cover the whole state, there are some more places I would add to this, maybe southwestern Oregon, but these would be kind of the major hotspots. And you can see that from the eBird data. Now with eBird data, we need to remember that this is not just where the birds are, where all the species are. That is true, but it's also a function of where the people are, right? So we tend to get the hot spots with the most data where there are cities, where people spend a lot of time. It's those things coming together. The interesting exception to that would be down here in southeastern Oregon, where there's very few people, but there's a lot of birds. So, you just always keep in mind what this data is. It's not necessarily the reality of where all the bird species are. Okay, so first up we have the Willamette Valley. This is probably where a lot of people visiting Oregon for the first time, this is going to be their first place where they're going to experience the birds in Oregon. They're relatively easy to access. Portland itself has lots of great hotspots to check out. So if we superimpose the ecoregions on that there, you see the Willamette Valley is itself its own ecoregion. And this is what it apparently looked like back in the mid-1800s. There was an artist named Paul Kane who painted this in 1847, looking out over the Willamette Valley with the river flowing from south to north through the center of it, with lots of patches of forest, of both Douglas fir-dominated forest, western hemlock, Oregon white oak, that sort of thing. Obviously, it would have been very beautiful. This was our kind of version of your Great Central Valley, right? So it used to be one thing, and now it's something different. So for us, it's something like this. Still very pretty in its own way, pastorally beautiful, but it has been converted quite heavily away from prairies and woodlands to agriculture and managed timber plantations, things like that. So there are patches of habitat, but it's been heavily modified. So here's one example, not an amazing photo, but an example of native Oregon prairie habitat or oak savanna. You see the oaks in there in the background We only have, at least in Northern Oregon, just one oak species. You guys have dozens of them. We just have the Oregon white oak, also called the Gary oak. But it's incredibly important wildlife tree for birds and many other animals. And so, when we lose those trees, it's really a shame. And so we get lots of wildflowers in these prairies and things, and they're, of course, very important for birds. The Willamette Valley, if you're a birder, is probably most interesting if you go to the series of national wildlife refuges we have, and that's what those black dots represent there. So there's a sort of chain of refuges north to south in the valley. These protect wetlands in many cases, but a variety of different habitats. And these are stopover sites for birds on migration along the Pacific Flyway, or they're wintering places for many different birds, particularly for waterfowl. This is where the dusky Canada goose, the subpopulation of the Canada goose, spends the winter. So it's very important for that. We have the cackling geese here. We have sandhill cranes, lots of great birding to do in the winter. So this is a place that's fun to go in the winter. And then up here in Portland, just north of Portland, there's a place called Sauvie Island. It is between the confluence of the Columbia and the Willamette River. And it's this big kind of flat island. Part of it's agricultural, but part of it is set aside for nature. And it has a small resident population of sandhill cranes, tons of waterfowl in the winter. Like you can see this picture here, lots of snow geese and cackling geese and all kinds of good stuff. So really a spectacular place to go birding with just 15, 20 minutes from downtown Portland. So really spectacular birding just outside of town. So that was the Willamette Valley. Let's move on to Bend. So now we've crossed east over the Cascades Mountains. We're in the rain shadow. Things are much drier. We're in this East Cascades ecoregion. And you can see it's kind of a narrow ecoregion there, a transition between the mountains and the high desert, or the more eastern ecoregions. But Bend, Oregon is there. Great place to visit. Lots of great birding to do around there. I've led tours specifically just around the Bend area. Many different interesting habitats. This is kind of the general scene out there. You have these vast areas of either ponderosa pine or lodgepole pine, or a mixture of the two. And a lot of it, of course, burns at one time or another, or has been harvested. But there's lots of habitat. There's lots of geologic landscape features, so it's really interesting in that regard. And so there's lots of places to look for birds in different ways, or different habitats. For example, this is a representation of old growth ponderosa pine forest, these kind of open gallery-like forests, really beautiful. Lots of interesting birds hanging out here. A wonderful place to go birding. And then if you keep going east, you end up in these kind of badlands areas where you have western junipers, sagebrush, with this really gnarly volcanic bedrock that makes it very difficult for anybody to have cattle or farming or anything. So that means it's easier for it to be set aside for nature. And so there's some interesting species out there. In this general area, other birds we'd be looking for would be things like Clark's nutcracker, Townsend's solitaire, pinyon jay, green-tailed towhee, Lewis's woodpecker. All of those things are in different habitats kind of centered around Bend or Sisters, different areas. And speaking of woodpeckers, there is actually the Dean Hale Woodpecker Festival that is held in Sisters, Oregon, real cute little town on the east side of the mountains there north of Bend. It happens every late May, early June. And the reason for this is because there are 11 woodpecker species that can be found in that area. And I think I've seen all of them. I think I've eventually seen all of them. I've never seen them all in one trip. And that's what a lot of folks do, is they go to this festival and they're trying to see all 11 species. I'll try to remember at least some of them here. So the logo there, that's a white-headed woodpecker. So you have white-headed, downy, hairy, pileated, Lewis's, and then Williamson's sapsucker, red-breasted sapsucker, American three-toed woodpecker, black-backed woodpecker, northern flicker, and I think that's it. I wasn't actually counting, so that might be 11. Anyway, really cool thing to do is go out there and go look for woodpeckers. So here's a couple photos of a couple of those species. The white-headed woodpecker is a really exciting one for a lot of folks. I know you guys do have those in California as well, but it's always exciting to see those when you go out to Bend. And the one on the right there is a black-backed woodpecker. And because there's so many fires on the east side there with the pines, then you look for kind of recently burned areas, and that's where you can often find these black-backed woodpeckers. And you can find the American three-toed woodpecker sometimes. Now this is an interesting species perhaps for you, because this is one of the few that is not in California. At least if it ever was or has been observed, it's very, very, very rare. You would want to come to California if you're really interested in seeing this. You'd want to come to Oregon if you're really interested in finding this bird. Or of course you could go other places where it lives, like, let's see, I think I've got a range map here. Yeah, so, but you can see we've just got it just coming down the Cascades kind of on the east side here, and just a little patchy distribution. And really it just kind of stops at the California border. So you'd need to go, there's all these other places you could look, but even then it's kind of hard. It's a little bit of a challenging bird to find, but that is one of the birds that we can offer you as something special if you come visit us in Oregon. Okay, so moving eastward now to southeastern Oregon, which is dominated by Malheur National Wildlife Refuge in terms of places to go birding. This place is really special. It's certainly, many would say it's the best birding in Oregon, and many would probably put it on one of the best birding spots in North America, if not the world. It's really a spectacular place to check out. And I'm guessing some of you have been there. I think, pretty sure Eric has. So again, we're looking at the ecoregions here. And so now we're down in southeastern Oregon. We're in the Basin and Range area. And there's one particular mountain here, Steens Mountain, that dominates the scene, this single escarpment that runs right through that area. And Malheur is on the west side of that. This whole part of Oregon is dominated by kind of sagebrush steppe, some grasslands, very, again, open country, lots of private land, lots of cattle ranching going on out here. Not many communities, not many places to get a hotel room, but certainly lots of places to camp, and just really a wonderful place if you like solitude and open country. It's a great place to go explore. And there are lots of interesting birds. So for those of us on the west side out here in the wet country, it's always fun to go out to find birds that are like this, like the sagebrush sparrow, or the sage grouse, the sage thrasher, basically all things sage, right? There's just a lot of fun stuff out there, and it can take a lot of work to find them sometimes. It's, that's part of the fun. They're just kind of way out there sitting on the top of a little sagebrush bush, and you've got to get your scope and really look for them. So this is a picture of Malheur National Wildlife Refuge itself. And it's basically got this series of wetlands from the rivers that are pouring off the west slopes of Steens Mountain. And they're somewhat seasonal, and they can just be a total riot of birds at different times of year. A lot of birds come through on migration, and also many birds are there wintering. So it's just this amazing place. And we do get, vagrants and rarities there, because of its proximity to the eastern edge of Oregon, and it's kind of out in the middle of nowhere. So there's a lot of things, a lot of weird things that show up there. Let me put it that way. So if you haven't been, great place to go visit. It takes a long time to get out there from anywhere. So you got to be ready to, let's say from Bend, it's a good 6 hours or so. So it's a long drive out there. But a few of the fun birds to see, there are hundreds of species out there, but, things like the bobolink. This is where we have a big population of bobolink out there, or at least big for Oregon. This is very much what we would think of as an eastern species. Black tern, let me get my head out of there. Black tern, sandhill cranes, just lots of water birds mixed with songbirds and shorebirds coming through on migration, all kinds of cool stuff. And this is zooming in now. We're looking at again, southeastern Oregon. That kind of big green blob here, that's Steens Mountain. And on the east side of it is called the Alvord Desert. So it's kind of like a mini rain shadow within a rain shadow. But on the west side, you see all these eBird hotspots. And the dark red one there, that's kind of the one that captures the data for the entire Malheur area. And there have been over 500 species that have been documented there. So really a great place. Of course, if you catch it at a certain time of year, you might be sharing the place with lots of mosquitoes. But other than that, it's really cool. And here's a map of the refuge from the National Wildlife Service. Okay, northeastern Oregon. So I've led tours kind of to all these places, and each of these places could be a week-long trip in itself, and it's really fun. So Northeastern Oregon is amazing. The dominant feature there are the Wallowa Mountains. This kind of big, massive mountains that is really geologically more like the Rockies than it is anything else in Oregon. It's there's a lot of granite there, and we don't typically have a lot of granite elsewhere. It is part of the Blue region, the Blue Mountains ecoregion, but again, it's got this kind of interesting geology. It has more of an affinity with the Rockies. And so because of that, not only is the geology more like the Rockies, so is the ecology, the ecosystems, the plants and animals and birds. So it's a really neat place, again, for those of us who live way out here in the West to go check out the Wallowa Mountains. There are beautiful lakes, these glacially carved lakes and, snow-covered peaks and big grasslands. We have Zumwalt Prairie out there, which is this very large, relatively pristine grassland preserved by the Nature Conservancy. So you can go experience the grasslands with all the birds and the flowers and the wildlife. And it's really incredible out there. So out in this area, we have a few more of those birds that you would expect in Oregon, but basically never see in California. And one of those would be the dusky grouse. So this would be a bird that you could find in the northeastern corner of Oregon and some other places too. But actually, let's look at the range. So northeastern Oregon primarily, and very much a Rocky Mountain species, right? You can see the rest of its range here is pretty much through the Rockies and maybe a little bit of basin and range. But yeah, so that would be a cool species for you to come up and look for in our neck of the woods. And let's see, we also have the spruce grouse up here as well. So that's another species you could look for. And then we have a few birds that aren't necessarily never found in California, but just maybe a little easier to find in Oregon. Birds that we certainly think are exciting, again, because they're kind of more eastern birds or more northern birds. So things like the veery, gray catbird, white-winged crossbill. And some of these birds, you kind of need to come or look for them more in the colder months, in the winter. And the crossbill might be an example of that. And certainly an example of that would be one of the coolest owls ever, and that is the northern hawk owl. And I've only ever seen this bird in Montana, and it was perched on a tree about 2 miles away. And, even then I was super excited. But we do get these here kind of here and there, typically in the winter. So they're a very northern species, and they're coming down in the winter, much like snowy owls do occasionally when you get eruptions. I don't know if hawk owls, if there are ever that many of them, maybe just a few, but a very cool bird to look for here in Oregon. And that again is out in the Northeast typically. They can be found around Bend and stuff occasionally too, if you get lucky. So that was northeastern Oregon. So now let's talk about the coast, which is what this talk was supposed to be entirely about, was the coast. But hopefully you enjoyed just getting a little bit of a primer of some of the other parts of Oregon. So the Oregon coast, again, is, many people find it quite beautiful. It's interesting to speak to you guys as an audience because you, of course, I assume most of you live close to the ocean. You live near incredibly beautiful places like Big Sur and right in your backyard. So, here I am going to sing the praises of the Oregon coast, but hopefully you guys, if you've ever visited, you would agree that it is a really great place. So I am now, I think, going to, switch back over. So pardon me for just a second. Almost there. Trying out this new exciting technology here. So we will see how this goes. Okay, well, there's me again. All right. And now we'll bring this back in. Okay, so we're talking about the Oregon coast, which is lovely. I've spent a lot of time out there. I used to have a day tour business based in Portland, and so I would take people on day tours out to the coast quite often. And I could say that it was probably my favorite place to go. I would take people to the Columbia River Gorge as well, Mount St. Helens, some other places. But every time we went to the coast, it was always just a magical day. It's really, really great out there. So along the coast, you have this narrow strip on the west side of the Coast Range, but there's an interesting mix of habitats. Of course, lots of forest, patches of old growth forest here and there, and much like some of the forests you guys have in your backyard with the redwoods, we have some pretty spectacularly large trees. They are few and far between, but we have Sitka spruce is very much a coastal tree, and we have Douglas fir, western hemlock. There are places I could take you to show you some really gorgeous, massive trees along the coast. And on our tour that we're doing with Golden Gate, we will definitely show you some big trees and some nice old growth rainforest. And then there are estuary habitats and bays and things, again, similar to some of the habitats you may have at home there, where we find a lot of water birds, shorebirds moving through. There's rocky coast and sandy coasts. So this really just great mix of places you can go visit within a relatively small area. You don't have to travel far to get to a different habitat. So one of the examples of a really nice place on the Oregon coast is Cannon Beach. And what you're looking at here is the iconic Haystack Rock on the right there, the big one. And that is not only a great place to go look at the tide pools, but also if you catch it at the right time of year, it's crawling with birds. Pretty much any time of year there are birds of some kind there, certainly seabirds and things, but a lot of birds breed there. And so it's a great place to go look for things like the tufted puffin. When you go birding on the coast, that's often one of the highlight species for folks to look for is the tufted puffin. I know you have them in California as well, but we do have some nice breeding colonies here, and Haystack Rock is one of them. I will say that on our tour that we're doing, we're doing it in September, and it is not the best time for puffins. So there's a chance there won't be any puffins. We chose that more based upon the weather, because at the coast, if you hit the weather wrong, as you can probably imagine, most times of the year it can be really wet and cold and windy and miserable. So we'll see. We'll look for puffins, but it's not necessarily peak puffin season at the timing of our tour. So along the coast, we have these rocky headlands, and primarily they're made out of basalt, this dark volcanic rock, and that basalt formed from lava that flowed sometimes hundreds of miles from eastern Oregon to western Oregon, which is really amazing. It flowed down the old path of the Columbia River and then spilled into the ocean, solidified into this black rock, and then was uplifted, giving us all of these cliffs and these sea stacks and all of this great seabird habitat. And that's why the northern Oregon coast in particular has lots of great places to go look for those kinds of birds. And perhaps compared to many places in California, the Oregon coast is relatively undeveloped. There are communities and there are some small cities, but they're surprisingly small and humble and sometimes quaint, or there's just stretches of just nothing. It's pretty amazing. So that's one of the reasons it's a great place to visit. It's very beautiful and there's lots of birds and wildlife. This is a figure from a study published in 2012, and I just wanted to show you the distribution of breeding bird colonies along the Oregon coast. And again, you don't have to worry about reading the fine print here. Just notice those big orange blobs. Those are colonies of over 100,000 seabirds, and then that next kind of smaller orange circle is 10,000 to 100,000 seabirds. So all along the Oregon coast, we have seabird colonies, and it's there's a lot of great habitat out there, and of course, lots of efforts to conserve our seabirds. Okay, so a little bit about the actual tour that we're doing. This is the first time we're doing an Oregon coast tour, and here's the funny thing is, our business is called Wild Latitudes. We do tours all around the world. We go to all these exotic places, and we've hardly ever done tours in our backyard in Oregon. We have done southwestern Oregon for Golden Gate Bird Alliance, and those have been really fun. And otherwise, this is I think our second offering in Oregon. So we're very excited about this. And let's see some of the details. So it's a week long from September 29th to October 5th. So late September, beautiful time of year. Often the weather is just spectacular. I mean, can't promise, but it is often very nice. Again, that's why we chose that time of year. And lots of great birds. And we might be catching kind of the tail end of the southward migration. And it's just a relaxing, fun time. There's a lot of good stuff. The price is $2,395 per person. I don't offhand know what the single supplement is. And I'll talk a little bit more about the itinerary, but if you're interested, please do contact the travel program at Golden Gate. And there's the email there if you don't have that already, travelprogram@goldengatebirds.org. Okay, so here is the actual circle, the loop that we're doing. We're starting in Portland, and we're going to follow along the path of the Columbia River, heading downstream to Astoria. And if you haven't been to Astoria, it's a cool seaside community. It has a long, rich history going back to from Lewis and Clark to the Astor expedition to the canning industry. It goes on and on. Of course, Native Americans before all of that. There's rich Native American history there. So a really neat place. We're going to spend a couple nights there. And there's a picture of the Astoria column looking out over the city. There's the Astoria Megler Bridge, which crosses the mouth of the Columbia River. So this is a really long bridge connecting Oregon and Washington. It's just a really neat town. I always enjoy going there. Lots of fun birding sites to check out around the area. Now, if you're interested in history at all, this is a great place to learn something about Lewis and Clark, because we will be literally following in the footsteps of Lewis and Clark, who came through in 1805. They came down the river and ended up camping just outside of Astoria in the winter of 1806. It's a pretty brutal winter because it was super rainy and wet, and they weren't used to that. And we actually go to Fort Clatsop, which is the site where they camped, and there's a recreation of their site there, made out of logs. Lots of historical information, lots to learn. Actually, a really nice place to go birding too. The forest all around there is protected. It's the National Park Service, and it's a beautiful site. So then we continue on down to Cannon Beach, which I showed you a picture of earlier with Haystack Rock. And it's a great artistic, charming town, great food, great beer, a lot of fun stuff to see, really, nice state parks and wonderful birding sites. This whole thing is just the way I think about it is very chill, very just fun, just well-rounded. You can kind of hear me trying to geek out on talking about trees and rocks rather than birds. If you come on our tours, that's kind of par for the course, is we like to have more well-rounded natural history tours with a focus on birds. But, we're out there, we're looking at all this cool stuff and things like history and, cultural highlights and things like that. So we always see lots of neat birds. You never know exactly what you're going to get, but and we come home with a nice list of species. So it's very exciting, and I hope that you guys will consider joining us. We have definitely plenty of room, and would love for you to check that out, again, late September. And if you get in touch with Golden Gate, they will send you the brochure. It looks like this, a PDF that'll have the details on the itinerary, the day by day, and all that good stuff, and how to sign up. And lastly, hopefully I wasn't talking too fast here today. It seems like it went by quickly. Lastly, I want to remind you about the Science of Birds podcast that Eric was very kind to mention. This was a thing that I started during the pandemic when I was like, I don't know what I'm going to do now. I have a travel business. How am I going to survive? And it wasn't necessarily with the intention of being super successful or making money or anything like that. But I started it, and I just kind of put my heart into it. And it's been pretty successful. People really seem to like it. Maybe some of you have listened to it. I hope you enjoy it. I try to be silly and funny, with mixed success, I'm sure, but people seem to like it. So check that out. You can find it in any podcast app, whether it's Apple Podcasts or whatever. You should be able to just search for it and find it. I think I'm up to 93 episodes now, so there's lots to listen to, and it's always a good time. So yeah, that's that. And I'd be happy to answer some questions.
We had Ivan. We had a question about peak puffin season, but it looked like somebody answered it. They said, "You want to confirm April to July?"
That is correct. Yep, they show up around April, and yep.
Okay. And I think I'm waiting to see if there's anything else. That was.
It's funny because that was one of the questions I figured.
Everybody loves the puffin.
Yeah, I know. Can't get enough of them. That's, we go to Iceland, obviously it's a different species, but the Atlantic puffin, it's just, I feel like if that's all you see, you go home happy.
That's all the questions it looks like we have.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. I want to thank you, Ivan. That's great to have you. And you can tell us the subject of the next Science of Bird.
Yeah. Okay. And that's coming soon. That is going to be the avian digestive system, which we're going to have a lot of fun with it. But, if you're like, what? Just, yeah. I mean, if those of you who know the podcast, you know it's going to be a lot of fun. So yeah, so it's very, I do try to make it very sciencey, very educational. It isn't just sitting around talking about birding. It's about the actual biology of birds. So we are doing the digestive system, baby. We're doing it.
Hey, another question did just come in. You
Okay.
didn't talk much about migration. Any comments on migration in Oregon?
Yeah, I mean, it's, going to be obviously similar timing to what you guys are used to, things moving through. So, kind of late August, early September along the coast would be a great place to look for migrants. And spring, May is when things hit really hard around here in the Willamette Valley, also out in the Malheur area. So, a lot of things are moving through. And then, I did kind of mention that you have these places where you have the wintering birds. So things like the Willamette Valley. There's also the Klamath Lakes, which I didn't mention, sort of central southern Oregon. I think it's the Winter Wings Festival where there's hundreds of bald eagles and, a lot of cool stuff down there. Yeah. So it's again, there are a lot of things using these sites within the Willamette Valley or the coast or Malheur as stopover sites to rest and refuel as they're going north or south.
And I got a question about when that digestive system podcast is going to hit.
Wow, we got some chomping at the bit, are we?
Yeah.
As soon as I can write the script for it,
Okay.
I've got yeah. So it hopefully my goal is for it to be like by this weekend is my hope.
Okay. Good to generate a little interest in that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. There's a lot of thank yous and a lot of enjoyed your presentation. So thanks.
Great, thanks
again.
everybody.
Yep. Looking forward to the trip.
All right, yeah, me too. Thanks, guys. Hope we'll see some of you there, and thanks for being here tonight. And it was a real pleasure as always.
Okay. Good night, everybody. Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Cheers.